Okay, can everybody hear me fine?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I'm going to talk about really three separate things today. One is the start of something called the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, and then I'll talk about the Eagle Claw mission in terms of trying to rescue 53 American hostages in Iran. With me in the audience is Phil Hansen, that was one of the Delta members. I understand Mel Wick is here, but I don't see Mel in the room. So, at any rate, let me get on with the presentation. So let's go back historically, and this thing called today the Delta Force, or more appropriately, 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, was the whole idea of somebody called Charlie A. Beckwith. And Charlie is, in fact, his correct given name, not Charles. So Charlie did an exchange tour with the British 22 SAS and actually passed their selection. And he never forgot about that. And so things happened over the years, and in the early 70s, he had worked for then Brigadier Robert C. Kingston on the Joint Casualty Resolution Center, and was one of Bob Kingston's team leaders. And so they got to meet at that point in time. Well, in 1976, Charlie was about to give up command of the Special Forces School, and Bob Kingston had taken over as commander of the JFK Center and Institute for Military Assistance. So because of the way that colonels in SF, there were few and far between, number one, were used at that point in time, Charlie went to General Kingston and asked for permission to do a study. And General Kingston granted that permission. So the study was going to be based on creating a very small 22nd Special Air Service type unit within Army Special Forces. And so he prepared this paper for presentation to a U.S. Army Training and Doctrine conference that was to be held later in the year. General Kingston reviewed it and said, "Charlie, you're speaking too much British language." So he assigned Colonel Tom Henry, that was a former member of both SFA and the Special Ops Association, to help Charlie clean up the language and put it into U.S. Army language, if you will. So Charlie and Tom Henry went to that TRADOC conference, presented the paper, and it went well, to include with the conventional people, because there was no threat to them. And like I said, it was supposed to be a very small element within the context of Special Forces at that point in time. So anyway, so Charlie and Tom Henry get back, and General Kingston says, "Okay, Charlie, you start proceeding furthermore to try and bring this study to fruition, and I'll start working the back channels with some of my general officer friends and acquaintances to help get approval for this concept." So as fate would have it, in March 1977, there was something called the Hanafi Muslim incident in Washington, D.C. How many of you have ever heard of that Hanafi Muslim incident? Okay, very few of you, okay? What it was, very succinctly, was where a spin-off group of the black Muslims in Chicago, Illinois, took over 3 buildings in downtown Washington, D.C. What had happened some years before is when the Hanafis broke away from the black Muslim movement, or Nation of Islam, Wallace Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, declared that members of Khalis, who was the leader of the Hanafi Muslims, should be killed. And they killed some 9 members of his family. They, in fact, were taken to court, convicted, and were in prison. But for Khalis, that was insufficient justice. So he and a very few followers took over 3 buildings in Washington, D.C. We were paralyzed in terms of the ability to go in and do surgical hostage rescue. There was no FBI hostage rescue team. The Washington Metropolitan Police Department was not capable. The National Military Command Center made a call to General Kingston at Fort Bragg because they had heard rumors that Special Forces were having some exchanges with the FBI. And that was true, but they were not robust exchanges, I gotta tell you that. So they asked General Kingston, can you send your Special Forces up here to Washington, D.C. to handle this incident? General Kingston, who himself had served an exchange tour in the United Kingdom, knew the difference between surgical hostage rescue and just getting online and charging into a building. So his answer to the National Military Command Center was, and I quote, "Only if you want to put the lives of all the hostages at risk," end quote. So the NMCC backed off and basically told the president that we had no surgical capability within the Army. Now, at that point, then General Kingston turned to Charlie and said, change your focus and start working on the counterterrorism aspects of what you propose. And Charlie did so. So, also at the same time, General Kingston went to his Command and General Staff College classmate, who was Lieutenant General Edward Shy Meyer, who was at that point in time today's equivalent of the Army G3, 5, and 7. So one of the most powerful people on the Army staff. So General Kingston says, Charlie, start proceeding, and Charlie proceeds to recruit 4 people to help him with the study team. And those 4 were Lieutenant Colonel Kurt Hurst, that became Delta's first S3, Major Chuck Odorizzi, that initially led selection and training for Delta, Major Bucky Burris, that had a variety of jobs, because those of you that know Bucky knows that he never wanted to be tied down to any job anyway. Okay. And then last but not least was Command Sergeant Major William R. Country Grimes. All great people, all great minds, and they really started to work hard. By June and July of 1977, Charlie already knew that the Army was going to give approval for the stand-up of 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, and he started recruiting. I know that personally because I showed up at the Sergeant Major Academy in July of 1977 and was met by a very good friend, Forrest Foreman, who was already a sergeant major, that told me, call Beckwith. And I said, what are you talking about? He said, I told you to call Beckwith. I said, okay, Forrest. So I called Colonel Beckwith, and I said, sir, this is Ish. He said, well, are you ready, boy? In Charlie's blunt fashion, and I had no idea what the hell he was talking about. And I said, sir, I have no idea. He said, God damn it, you're the intel puke. You know what I'm talking about. And I said, sir, I really don't. He said, yeah, you know. So I said, sir, I have one question for you. And he said, what's that? I said, are you going to trick F me again? And he laughed, and he said, I guess that means you're coming on board. And I said, yes, sir. And the reason why was that SF had downsized from a high of 12,000 in Vietnam to less than 3,500. And there was no assurance that I would ever go back into an SF assignment. But I knew with Beckwith, if you wanted to be where the action was, good, bad, or indifferent, you sign up, and I did. So by July, like I say, June and July, he was already starting to recruit. He wanted 2 years to achieve what is called full operational capability. And the reason why was that he wanted a totally different assessment and selection course, and he wanted a very changed operator training course other than what was given in Special Forces in those days. And that's why he asked for 2 years to achieve that full operational capability, understanding also that he was going to start from scratch and have to recruit people. So unfortunately, what happened in July of 1977 was Bob Kingston got moved to Korea to replace our longtime SOA and SFA member, Major General Jack Singlaub, after Jack had gotten fired by President Carter for refusing to stop speaking out against the removal of troops in Korea, which General Singlaub saw as going to be very propitious in terms of starting another Korean War. So anyway, General Kingston left. But at the point he left, he had already greased the skids for the so-called Delta Force to be formed. Major General Jack V. McMull, a great general officer, but an Army aviator with virtually no special operations experience, took over from General Kingston. Now, General McMull, in terms of briefing the concept for first SFOD Delta, was approached by the Forces Command Commander, 4-star general, and McMull being a 2-star general. And that 4-star said, okay, I understand Beckwith wants 2 years for full operational capability. What are you, McMull, going to do in the interim if anything happens? Because I'm going to hold you doggone personally responsible if you can't respond. And McMull was floored. He candidly didn't know what to do. So he turned to Colonel Bob Mantell, who was the commander of the 5th Special Forces Group, and that was the start of something that many of you have heard of called Blue Light. Okay? So, Blue Light had no real selection and assessment course. They picked a bunch of very, very good people, very, very good people, most of whom had combat experience in Vietnam. And that formed the Blue Light Force. And they trained very hard, and they broke their butts, thinking erroneously that they had a chance to get the counterterrorist mission. And that was not true. And candidly, as far as I'm concerned, Colonel Mantell told them a lie and fueled their belief that they could get the mission. Now, you know, things happen for a reason. So in October 1977, Grenschutz Group of 9, which was formed after the 1972 Munich Olympic massacre, when Islamic terrorists killed some 11 Israeli athletes, okay? At that point in October of 77, they went into Mogadishu, Somalia, and rescued captives or hostages that were held on a hijacked airliner. They did it with the help of the 22nd Special Air Service from the United Kingdom. And it came out in the media that they used something called flashbangs. Just by chance, Charlie was in the Pentagon that day talking to General Meyer, and the word came around, what the hell is a flashbang? Well, the only guy that knew what a flashbang was at that point in time in the Pentagon was Charlie Beckwith. So he explained to General Meyer, and General Meyer took that up to General Rogers, who was the Army Chief of Staff, and now we had an explanation. At that point, General Rogers, the Army Chief of Staff, became knowledgeable about this thing called First SFOD Delta, and really nodded upon the briefing by General Meyer to get the unit started, okay? So, in fact, he signed the orders that were dated actually for November, but actually those orders were received down in Delta in December of 1977, okay? Backdated to show the creation of the unit date being 19 November 1977. Well, in April 1978, because there's a furor about what is this thing called Blue Light. So General Meyer and a number of other ranking generals come down to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And we in Delta, in a very minuscule stage, neophyte stage at that point in time, gave our staff briefings. And then General Meyer looked at us on Delta and said, thank you, gentlemen. Colonel Beckwith, remain in the room. All the rest of you are excused. Being the sneaky intel puke, I slowly closed the door. And I swear the last words I heard were, what the F is Blue Light? And I shut the door. And I came out, and Dick Potter, who was our deputy, and a number of us on the staff, because we had no real operational squadron at that point in time, thought this might be the end of us. And so literally, we were out in the foyer of the stockade, which had become Delta's headquarters, and started singing songs. And pretty soon, after about an hour, the door opens. Charlie comes huffing and puffing out, and followed by General Meyer with a smile on his face. And basically, what General Meyer had told General McMullen was shut down blue light. So, because it never had, number one, Army staff approval to stand up. And that's very unfortunate because, like I said, the blue light folks busted their butts. If we look at their legacy, the so-called Special Forces Advanced Reconnaissance Exploitation Techniques, etc. course was really created by those blue light guys today. So they left a good legacy. But again, they never had a chance for the mission and were shut down in April of '77. Okay? General Meyer said, Charlie, regardless, you're going to have to undergo an evaluation. And that evaluation would be conducted by Readiness Command and the 18th Airborne Corps. And so we were forced to undergo a validation exercise in July 1978. Okay. So we passed that that trial. We continued our assessment and selection courses and our operator training courses. Initially, selection was done in Pisgah National Forest and then moved to West Virginia. There was a high attrition rate in assessment and selection, but nonetheless, we were getting people through the turmoil of having to go through a very rough and rugged assessment and selection course. On the fast forwarding, on the 4th of November, 1979, we had about 90 qualified operators at that point in time. And we were not forced, but we were asked to undergo a, quote, international validation by Lieutenant General Meyer. And the purpose for it was to seal Delta's fate as the only certified counterterrorist organization in the entire United States government. Very skillfully done by General Meyer. So our international validators included Ulrich Wegner, the first Grenzschutz Group of 9 commander out of Germany, Christian Poutot, the French Gendarmerie Intervention Counterterrorist Unit commander, and Johnny Watts, who had previously commanded the 22nd Special Air Service and was now head of the United Kingdom's Special Forces. So those were our international validators. Other validators came from the FBI, DIA, CIA, etc. We passed with flying colors. We went to sleep. About 6:30 that morning, I was woken by Randy Hofers, who was one of our main radio operators, and who told me, Ish, they've taken the U.S. Embassy in Iran again. Because that was the second time in 1979, the first time being February of 1979. So we had, like I say, 90 to 100 operators at that point in time, and now we were going to be confronted with something that became called the Iran hostage crisis. Okay? The situation on November the 4th in Iran was this, like I said, was the second takeover of the embassy in 1979. The first time was when the Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran out of Paris, France, and he directed that the embassy be turned back over to America very quickly, and it was, okay? But not this time. So initially, there were close to 100 hostages because there were visitors from other countries inside our embassy in Tehran at that time. And then eventually, it was figured out that there were, in fact, 66 Americans being held hostages. In addition, there were 6 other Americans that were being hidden by the Canadians and would be brought out later in January 1980 and it was something called Argo, And in fact, some of you may have seen that movie, Argo, where in fact the agency went in with a guy named Tony Mendez with false passports and brought out the 6 Americans. But anyway, out of the initial 66, the Iranians, trying to use it as propaganda, released most of the women, less 2, and all of the blacks, less 1, Charlie Jones. And the reason they did it was as a propaganda effort to show that America was racist. America was, in fact, anti-feminine. Well, they made a mistake with the 2 females because they were not CIA people, and they made a mistake with Charlie Jones because he was not CIA, but he was defiant and literally spat in his captors' faces. So they said he must be CIA. So they kept those with them, okay? The Middle East was in total turmoil. But what it meant in those days was there were no close-in launch bases. We had absolutely no national indicators and warning of the event. Nobody knew that something big would happen on that particular day. When our people in the embassy were taken hostage, that included a very small Central Intelligence Agency station. And there were 3 case officers and a couple other communicators supporting that. But now they were hostages. We were left without any stay-behind agents inside Iran whatsoever. There was no standing counterterrorist task force, so everything had to be created from scratch, less the Delta Force. Special operations as a whole was an absolutely low ebb, less than 8,000 throughout the whole force. About 1,000 SEALs, like I said, 3,500 to 3,800 special forces, only 1 squadron in what is today the Air Force Special Operations Command, etc. So far less than 8,000 total in special operations in those days. To quickly forward, if you contrast that with 70,000 under the umbrella of the United States Special Operations Command today, that'll give you an idea of what a low ebb we were at, okay? We're going to be faced with a very modernized military in Iran, okay? Whoop. Plus a population in Tehran of over 5 million that could be incited to riotous behavior instantaneously, okay? This is what the country of Iran looked like at that point in time. And the world has changed mightily, but what I'm pointing out is all of this area here is the Soviet Union, along with this area up here, okay? And then this was Afghanistan, or is Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Here's Iraq, and Iraq was not our friend in those days. So what this effectively meant was that we had no close-in launch bases, and we had to plan a very complex 2-night operation to get all the way from the Gulf down here to Tehran and back out of country. We were afraid to put a carrier battle group inside the Persian Gulf or Arabian Gulf because of the inveterate fear that the mouth of the Gulf would be mined and then that carrier battle group could be decimated ship by ship. Okay? That's how weak we were in America at that point in time. So that's what the situation was like. People said, well, why don't you come out of Afghanistan? There were no air refuelable helicopters sufficient to get us from Afghanistan to Tehran and back out. And the same thing with Pakistan. Time distance factors just too great, okay? The same with the Gulf nations where our diplomatic relations were not what they are today. So at any rate, then a task force had to be created. And it was within the bowels of the Pentagon within 1 week of the 4th of November 1979. That entire task force consisted of less than 70 people, okay? Contrast that with the Standing Counterterrorism Task Force that was created in the aftermath, which has well over 2,000 people assigned to its headquarters alone today, okay? The Joint Chiefs of Staff, J3 Special Operations Division, provided the cadre. So Jerry King, who was a colonel at that point in time in J3 SOD, became was tasked multiply to be the chief of staff, the deputy commander, and the J3, as an example. Okay? General Meyer had to pick a general officer to take command. So he picked a gentleman by the name of Major General Jim Fott, who had absolutely no special ops experience. And the first time we were introduced to him in Delta, he started rambling about, I saved 1 million Chinese. And I looked at my buddy Forrest Foreman, and I whispered to Forrest, and I said, does he mean during the Boxer Rebellion or at the end of World War II? He had this raspy voice and wrinkly face, and so I nicknamed him the Neanderthal Man. But he was a great guy, yeah. The Air Force actually provided Major General Phil Gass, who actually outranked General Vought, but had no real operational experience, but had served in Iran doing foreign military sales. So he was ostensibly the deputy, but in fact, Jerry King, former Special Forces, in fact, was the deputy. Rod Lenahan was the Air Force officer that became the J2. Jerry King, like I said, was multiple tasks. And then, in terms of organizations, Delta had to be plussed up because we had insufficient operators. So we were plussed up by Detachment A out of Berlin, okay, to include Colonel Stan Olszewicz that was going to go in on the mission, and 12 other members of Detachment A. And their target was supposed to be the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where we knew definitively that there were 3 hostages being held. We also were plussed up with Iranian drivers that the CIA provided to us. The CIA allowed us to vet those drivers, and wonderfully, they were put through their paces, and every one of them passed muster, okay? Phil, were you involved with those, or? No, okay, with Doug Petstall, and, yeah, okay. But every one of them passed muster, so what I'm telling you is that CIA did a good job in terms of selecting those people. Then we had so-called driver monitors. These were U.S. personnel in uniform that ostensibly, and I stress ostensibly because some of them did not speak Farsi very well, but ostensibly they were selected because they could speak Farsi. So their role was to sit next to the drivers, and if they detected something unward happening, then they would pull out a suppressed weapon and try to deal with the incident. Okay. And at the last minute, President Carter declared that we should take on 2 Manpads missile guys out of the 82nd Division, that were going to add nothing to the force whatsoever. Okay. So, excuse me. In addition, we were going to use Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 75th Rangers. And they would help us on night 1 with roadblock security, and on night 2 by seizing an airstrip south of Tehran, which was to be the departure airfield. Okay? And then we had but 1 special operations wing in the entire Air Force, and they had to be plussed up also. Mind you, at that point in time, that whole 1st Special Operations Wing had a total of 20 aircraft, to include 6 AC-130 gunships, and the others being MC and EC-130s. Today alone, remember I said 20 total, today alone, we have a little bit less than 40 gunships in the inventory. So again, to show you the contrast in terms of what we had in those days and what we have now. Okay? So in addition, the Military Airlift Command, today's Air Mobility Command, had to provide C-141 transport aircraft and KC-135 tankers that were going to help us with refueling on the mission. Okay. The weakest element organizationally was that we had no per se helicopter organization that we were going to turn to. So an ad hoc one had to be created with the initial pilots being Navy pilots because, correctly, the assumption was that the Russians, or the Soviet Union in those days, and the Iranians would be surveilling our carrier battle group, both by air and surface. And so to hide the fact that we might be using helicopters, it required helicopters with foldable tail booms and foldable rotor blades so that they could be stored on the so-called hangar deck below visual observation rather than on the top or flight deck visible to any surveillance, either on the surface or through the air. So the initial thought was that because we're going to use Navy helicopters, we ought to get Navy pilots. You know, God bless those guys, they tried, but they absolutely did not have the kinds of training or experience that would allow them to fly the mission. And also the fact that everybody was experimenting with different kinds of aspects in those days. So in particular, trying to fly with night vision goggles. And these were first generation night vision goggles without much light gain and with almost no depth perception whatsoever. And these were very tough times for any aviator to try and to attempt to fly with night vision equipment. But they tried, and they did not, candidly, cut the mustard. So in December of '77, the Marine Corps provided the bulk of the air crews that were going to take over from the Navy guys. Okay? Now, one of the very bad things was that there had been no contingency planning done for Iran and the kind of thing that we were faced with. So from scratch, we had to look at different kinds of operational concepts. Why don't you guys jump in? Well, there's a high chance of our people getting hurt. No. Why don't you jump in? You claim that you got Halo capability. Jump on the roof of the embassy. And, you know, we looked at them and we said, you know, yeah, we can do that. Well, why aren't you planning that? Because, dumbass, I can jump in that way, but I can't jump out with 53 American hostages. Oh. Air landing infiltration and exfiltration. We looked at air landing onto one of two airstrips outside of Iran, seizing those and trying to hold them for a few days. That was bizarre. We also looked at landing at the international airport, Mirabad International, and Doshan Tapa, which was the Iranian Air Force headquarters. The problem was that we could have done that, but then we would have to transport our forces to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the U.S. Embassy, and then back to that departure airfield. In a city of 5 million, and shades of what would happen on 1990 in Mogadishu, Somalia, when we had 19 people killed there on that particular operation. Okay? We looked at clandestine land infiltration, building facades behind trans-international trucks, too high risk. And again, how we were going to get the people out. So all of those were scrubbed. We looked at different combinations, and in mid-December 1979, we came up with the final concept. That final concept included 3 specific phases and 2+ nights of operation. In phase 1, the CIA actually brought a great American by the name of Bob Plan out of retirement, and they sent him back into Iran with 1 Iranian asset and gave him a mission impossible. He was to try and collect intelligence, he was trying to do reconnaissance, and we gave him some administrative tasks that were very, very crucial to success. So, not the least of which was he had to procure trucks and a warehouse and gasoline to store those trucks because we knew that we would use that on night 2 to transport the force from a hide site into Tehran to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the U.S. Embassy. So Bob Plan played a very key role. God bless his soul, he passed away 3 years ago. He was an original member of the OSS and fought in Yugoslavia during World War II. Great American. We also knew that we had to find a desert refuel site and perform a reconnaissance there. Okay? And we had to do a reconnaissance of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs because we had quite a bit of information on the U.S. Embassy compound itself and surrounding area, but we had almost nothing on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And that was to be Detachment A out of Berlin's target. And so we also needed to, prior to the launch of the rescue mission, covertly put in a 4-person DoD advance team. And we needed to move to our intermediate and forward staging bases without detection and preserving operation security. So the intermediate staging base was a former MiG-21 airfield built by the Soviet Union for the Egyptians in the middle of the desert at a place called Wadi Kenya in Egypt. And the 2 forward support locations would be Masura Island off of the Oman and the USS Nimitz, where the helicopters were going to be staged out of. Okay? On phase 2, what would happen is one MC Combat Talon 130 would launch from Masura Island at the same time that the 8 helicopters would lift off of the USS Nimitz. The first 130 would land an hour ahead of everybody at this landing zone called Desert 1 and establish security. The other reason that one would go in initially by itself was if the weight of the desert floor could not put up with a 130 and it crash landed, then the rest of the mission would be aborted, and all we would have lost were the 40-some-odd packs on board that 130 and that 130. Okay? So about an hour after that first one lands, then the plan was for the other 130s to come in, to include some with fuel bladders on board, and that they would be closely followed in by the helicopters flying off of the Nimitz. Refuel the helicopters and move on to something called the Garmsar area, which was about 80 kilometers southeast of Tehran. Hide out for the day. And here's what night 1 looked like. Actually, we would start out by coming out of Wadi Kenya, flying down the Red Sea on C-141 jet aircraft, and flying to Masura, Oman. 6.5-hour flights. Then we would do a 2-hour layover, and 40-some out of us would jump on the first MC-130, fly into Desert 1. Okay. As I mentioned, that first 130 would lift off at the same time 8 helicopters were leaving the USS Nimitz. So at that point, we would be greeted by the advance party and go into hiding for the day. The helicopters were going to be asked to fly into the surrounding hills and mountains, and the ground force would just go to ground at that point where they were dropped off. Continuing with the final operational concept, phase 3, or night 2, would look like this. The Rangers would come out of Wadi Kenya, overfly Saudi Arabia, and then overfly an airstrip called Manjariye. It was just an unimproved airstrip used by the Iranian Air Force adjacent to a bombing range. If they saw people or obstacles on that airstrip, they would jump in, remove those obstacles and the threat, and then bring in the rest of the aircraft, to include the C-141s that were going to fly the rescue party and the hostages out of Iran. Okay? 4 AC-130s were going to fly overhead over Tehran, some of them with pre-designated targets and the others in direct support of the ground force, in particular at the embassy. Okay? And then on the ground, what would happen is the advance party would come out, pick up the drivers and driver monitors, go back to the warehouse, drive back out to the hide site, pick up the ground force. Det A would proceed on one vehicle to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Delta would proceed to the U.S. Embassy compound. Okay. Recover the hostages and then bring in the helicopters and move to Manjari on those helicopters. Destroy the helicopters here and evacuate via C-141. So that's what the plan was. Okay? And here's what night 2 looked like. Okay? Again, the Rangers would come out of Wadi Kenya, overfly Saudi Arabia, go to the Manjari area. The C-141s would actually come out of Dhahran, okay, Saudi Arabia, and meet up. There were holes in the Iranian radar screen that had been selected very, very closely. Okay? And I'll show you more pictures as to the whole thing. So, again, here's night 2. So, Embassy, Ministry of Foreign Affairs over here, okay, extraction airfield, quite a significant difference south of Tehran. So they come out, trucks pick up the rescue force, drive in, and out of the lager site will come the helicopters. Here's a picture of what Desert 1 looked like. All it was a dirt road. Why they made these exquisite curves here is beyond me. But this flat area here was sufficient to land the 130s. And so that's what the plan was at Desert 1. Okay? Here's what the U.S. Embassy compound looked like. Okay? 27 acres, 14 major structures on it. A 12-foot high wall running down this side here, and a soccer stadium across the street. Okay? This is the motor pool gate into the embassy compound. And we knew that the student militants had their headquarters here in the motor pool area. Okay? Just a sample of the kinds of crowds that were gathered in Tehran almost on a daily basis. The 12-foot high wall alongside Roosevelt Avenue in those days that we would plan to breach and then cross the road to go into the stadium compound. Okay? So the plan was, once the squadrons gather up the hostages, a hole would be blown in that 12-foot high wall, cross the street into Amjadieh Soccer Stadium. And that's where the helicopters would come in and extract the force. To be candid, the first time that plan was hatched, I looked at Colonel Beckwith and I said, "Boss, the only damn difference between this and the Alamo is Davy Crockett didn't have to fight his way into the Alamo." It was based on rampant speculation by a jerk that was on the task force as a liaison officer from Delta, but was not Delta qualified. And if you want to know his name, I'll tell you his name. Jackass Jesse Johnson. Okay? So Johnson had speculated that these two fields here, large fields, were mined. And we had conclusive evidence from imagery every day that they were not mined. But he convinced General Vaught that they were mined, and so we were going to use the stadium. Well, here's the difficulty, folks. You can bring in 153 into each of these fields at one time. In a soccer stadium, you can bring in only 153 at a time. So that would have made the operation to exfiltrate people a hell of a lot longer and a hell of a lot more dangerous. Excuse me. But that's what the plan was. Here's what the Ministry of Foreign Affairs looked like. As I said, we had 3 hostages definitively that we knew were there. No intelligence on this whatsoever. So in March, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but in March, we dispatched Scotty McEwen, who's since deceased, and a great American, Clem Lemke, out of Det A, into Iran to reconnoiter the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They were given explicit instructions by their handler, Jim McKee, who is a Marine major out of Sakhir, and Jim's instructions to them were, under no circumstances will you attempt to get inside the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Clem, using his past experience and his sixth sense, said, F you. And so they came back, he and Scotty, with pictures, detailed pictures of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the guard force. They literally had their arms draped around some of the guards. And in the background, details of doors, windows, etc. God bless Special Forces guys like Clem Lemke and Scotty McEwen. Okay? So, here is, and I'm sorry for the size of the imagery, but here's Tehran up here, and here's the Garmsar hide site down over here. So, a significant difference, like I said, about 80 kilometers away from Tehran. And here is the location of Manzari, and here's Tehran up here. So another significant distance that would have to be covered in order to get the force out. Here's what the Manzari airstrip looked like. Unimproved airstrip, okay? And as I mentioned, Charlie Company, 1st and 75th Rangers, would overfly it. Any obstacles or people on the ground, they jump in. If not, bring everybody in airland, okay? And here's what their ground plan looked like. I won't go into all the details in the interest of time, okay? And we're getting ready to go. So here's a picture of a hangar in Wadi Kenya, Egypt, that MiG-21 air base built by the Soviets. Here's Jerry Boykin, then a captain, leading us in prayer prior to mission launch. Here are the guys boarding the C-141 Starlifter that are going to take us from Wadi Kenya to Masira Island. General Jim Vaught, Colonel Charlie Beckwith. Okay. On board the USS Nimitz, the RH-53D model helicopters getting ready to launch and launching very successfully, thanks to the captain of the USS Nimitz that avoided Russian trawler surveillance through a plan that he had built over a number of days. Okay. At Masira Island, the EC and MC-130s all lined up, ready to fly into Desert One. A marvelous sight. Okay. Well, what happened? The advance party got into Tehran. Actually, before that, a successful reconnaissance of Desert One was done. The CIA flew a Twin Otter. Some of you may know the name, so I'll give them. Jim Ryan, the one-legged CIA pilot, flew that bird in. Okay. His co-pilot was Charles Bud McBroom, former SF commo man, former SF medic, decided, geez, I need to make money, went to OCS, got riffed after Vietnam, became an aviation warrant, retired, and went to work for Air Branch at CIA. So he was a co-pilot. The other person on board that recon Twin Otter was John Carney, the father of what is today called the Air Force Special Tactics Group. So the combat controllers on steroids. So they went in and they had a 3-part mission. Confirm the holes in the Iranian radar coverage, which they did. see if you can successfully land on the desert floor at Desert 1, which they successfully did. Take soil samples so that we can provide them to scientists and affirm that the soil can put up with the weight of C-130 aircraft, and they successfully did that. That was at the end of March. So we sent in the advance party a little bit over a week before the mission is to be launched in 1980. That four-person party consisted of Scotty McEwen, Clem Lemke that I already described, Dick Meadows, and probably the most important person was Fred Arouji, then an Air Force sergeant, born and raised in Iran, naturalized citizen that had the eyes and ears of an Iranian. And I can describe a few things that he did that really prove his value. So as I mentioned, now in terms of actually what happened, that first C-130 launches right on schedule along with the 8 helicopters. And we're supposed to land an hour ahead of everybody. And we land at Desert 1 right on schedule. Okay? There are some 40 of us on board that aircraft. We were unaware of the progress of the helicopters because strict radio silence was being followed, and the fact that they had run into an area of suspended dust. Shortly after landing, we encounter a bus, and we stopped that bus with 43 passengers on board. Shortly after that, we encounter a 3,000-gallon fuel truck coming down to the desert. And I fired, if I had gone to a court of law, in my mind, 7 well-placed rounds at that truck, and it's still coming. And I looked over at Ranger Bob Rubio, and I said, "Rube, sir, fire." And he launched a light anti-tank weapon, and the next words out of my mouth were, "Holy shit, a fuel truck, a 3,000-gallon fuel truck." And we had a jet of flame going up in the air. The truck did not explode, but a jet of flame going up in the air well over 100 feet. And my rationalization was, oh, them damn Marine chopper pilots needed a beacon to fly in on anyway. But I had fired 17 rounds at that truck, candidly was having flashbacks to Vietnam, saying, damn it, I know I'm not going to stop. And I knew it was a truck because of the height and the spread of the lights. I'm not going to stop it with a 5.56 millimeter, but I'm going to try. And I wish that I was back in Vietnam with my Vietnamese camp commander, Dai Huy Tru, hand-holding a M60 machine gun and hosing down the lead vehicle in a 4-truck NVA convoy coming down outside of Bù Đắp, Vietnam. But that was not to be. Nonetheless, we stopped the damn truck. Okay. So what we didn't know was what had happened to the helicopters. And later, as we found out, the 8 launched fine, they hit the coast-in point, and one had a blade imminent failure light, and following proper safety procedures, went to ground. Another one went down, picked up the crew, and they rejoined in formation. They hit a first area of suspended dust. They came out of it and regathered into formation. And this one was a much larger one, and they totally broke formation. So in and amongst that, one candidly turned steel, claiming later they had navigational problems, and flies back for 4.5 hours to hit this speck in the Indian Ocean called the USS Nimitz. Don't bullshit me about navigational problems. Okay. Loss of courage. The others came in, the 6 others, but like I say, they were not in formation, so they came in one by one. So this is the way they were supposed to fly in, and the way that they actually did start to fly in until they hit that large area of suspended dust and had to totally break formation because there was absolutely no visibility whatsoever. Okay. As I mentioned, the first one lands. We encountered the bus, we encountered the fuel truck. The rest of the 130s come in right on schedule. And the helicopters then proceed to arrive about 57 minutes, almost an hour later. Candidly, it was a glitch in planning, okay? And only 6 of 8 land on the ground. Ed Seifert was then a lieutenant colonel, Marine Corps, and Ed was, in fact, if you will, the squadron commander for the helicopters. He goes around to make a last-minute check of the helicopters and finds a hydraulic pump literally glowing red. And he goes to Colonel Beckwith and Jim Kyle, who is a ranking Air Force guy on the ground, and says, "Sirs, I have only 5 flyable." Well, all the way back in mission planning, we had declared that we must leave Desert One with 6 flyable. And the reasons were immense, but mainly it pertained to capacity of the helicopters. The fact that Tehran was a mile plus high, and these weren't the most robust 53 aircraft that we had available. Okay. They were less capable, and on and on. So remember, we were going to go in with over 100 people on the ground, 4-person advance party, 53 hostages to bring out. You start adding up the numbers, and we had to do it in 2 locations. So that tells you clearly why we needed a minimum of 6 flyable out of Desert One. Okay. At that point, the mission is aborted. Then Major Jim Schaefer was the first one in. So he had refueled his helicopter. The plan is to fly the helicopters back out to the Nimitz. He lifts up, proceeds forward, for some inexplicable reason, loses control, and his rotor blades cut into the forward cockpit of the EC-130 and the wing fuel tanks on the port side with all the Delta's B Squadron on board. And it is a big, big fire that erupts at that point in time. And frankly, it's disaster at that point. And here's what it looks like in the aftermath. That's the rotor head of Jim Schaefer's RH-53D helicopter. He and his co-pilot, very badly burnt, struggled out of the cockpit and were picked up by our guys, and they lived to tell the tale for another day. The rest of the helicopters abandoned ship. Why, I don't know, and I'll not speak for them. But they left on board all of this equipment, to include state-of-the-art Vinson crypto systems, keyed, and that cost us big time in terms of our national crypto security for a period of time. Okay. Another picture, and in the background you can see the flat area of Desert One. Pictures the following day at the site, taken by the Iranians, and then a picture of our guys arriving back at Wadi Kenya, very dejected after not being able to complete the mission. We lost 8 great Americans, 3 Marines, 5 Air Force on that particular day. And annually, on April 24th, 25th, we pay homage to them at a memorial built by an organization called No Greater Love in Arlington National Cemetery. We have time, so I'm going to show you a very short video of about 5 minutes length. And bear with me, because I got to shift gears and bring up this video. I'm not going to turn up the volume, because this video was done by a British reporter by the name of John Snow, and he makes many speculative, erroneous conclusions. So I am not going to play the audio, but I will attempt to narrate what the heck is going on. So here's generally an overhead image, not in particular of the Desert One area, but of Iran in general. And now we're getting closer to the Desert One area from an aerial shot. Here's the dirt road leading to the Desert One site. Oh. Let me stop. Still not playing, huh?
Is that music associated with the video?
Huh?
I hear some music. Is that
Yeah.
part of the video?
Yeah, I don't know what the heck's going on here. Well,
You got slide 41 on it, that's why.
huh? I'm showing a slide up there?
Yeah.
Okay, so let me,
I think if you hit escape and come out of the slideshow.
yeah, so,
Anybody's grandson or granddaughter here?
okay. Okay, so the video's coming up now. Like I say, this is just an overhead of Iran in general. Here's the dirt road leading to Desert One that this Brit reporter went in 1 or 2 days later to try and do exclusive coverage. And now they're approaching the scene of Desert One. You see a lot of flat area, and you see where there was a 1-foot berm or so. You saw at least one of the abandoned helicopters. And you see Iranian military vehicles. Another of the abandoned helicopters. I don't know where the sea ration cans came from. They certainly didn't come from our guys. Cockpit of the 130s. The Marines were supposed to destroy the helicopters, and frankly, they panicked, and so they were not destroyed. On the other hand, here's my famous truck. And I'll never go back to Iran because, yeah, there's evidence that I did have some marksmanship training, to include shooting out the damn windshield and glass flying into the driver's eyes. And he's coming up with bullshit about seeing 2 Americans crawling on the ground, which is totally untrue, okay? Because I was dressed in a funky jacket, a watch cap, blue jeans, and I hope if everybody saw me, they'd think that I was the second coming of Genghis Khan through Iran. And the desert site again. You see the wreckage there. And this illustrates, people have said, why didn't you guys stay there and bring out the bodies? Well, we knew that fire would last for at least 2 to 3 hours. And it was intensely hot. Pretty soon you'll see some melted aluminum to illustrate how hot it was. Okay? And it was a choice of leaving and abandoning the bodies here or staying and having the entire rest of the force decimated. So we decided to leave. We put the pressure, however, on the Iranians, and all the bodies of the 8 were returned within 1 week. So they understood in the end they better not mess with the United States of America. But the carnage that occurred there, the molten aluminum. Interestingly, one wing of that 130 survived with virtually no damage. Go figure. Okay. But Desert One, where the mission failed. Okay. Ironically, you see these holes in the aircraft. The following day, the Iranian Air Force was given instructions, if you see those helicopters trying to leave, shoot them. And so what the crews of the helos did not do was put the lock on the rotor blades. And so the wind was turning the rotor blades, and the Iranian Air Force stupidly and erroneously thought, they're trying to take off. And they shot those helicopters, killing 2 of their own people on the ground. Hallelujah. Okay. So anyway, I'll stop this video now, but that's what it looked like. Okay. So just give me a few seconds and okay, so the main reason for failure was just simply insufficient helicopters to continue the mission. I've mentioned these things, the altitude in Tehran, the numbers and weight of people we had to bring out, the fact that the RH-53 model helicopter starts with a compressed air starting system. So once you're out of compressed air, there's no way to start the bird. No auxiliary power unit, okay? 2 locations for pickup, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, U.S. Embassy, and the fact that the Iranians had, in fact, a robust U.S.-provided and Soviet-provided air defense system. In the aftermath, the former Chief of Naval Operations, James Holloway, was asked to form a very small committee to come up with their conclusions. His committee members included the renowned Sam Wilson, okay, Meros Murad in World War II, SF Group Commander, attaché, defense attaché to the Soviet Union, Director of the Defense Intel Agency, Deputy Director of CIA, very knowledgeable of Special Ops. Lieutenant General retired Barney Maynor, that led the Sante operation, U.S. Air Force, okay. Then Major General Al Gray, later to become Commandant of the Marine Corps, and 2 other general officers that, candidly, I forget their names, but very qualified. Small, hard-hitting panel, and here were their major conclusions. That a small clandestine mission was, in fact, a valid concept, that the operation was, in fact, feasible, that the mission justified. It was a high-risk mission, and men and machines would be pushed to the max. That it took the force all the way from November until March before it was ready. That Operation Security was paramount to success and done well. Command and control was excellent at the higher levels, but tenuous and fragile at the intermediate levels. Basically, I think they made a mistake on that one, because what Desert One was what all of us would feature as a marshalling site, where independently the Air Force had to come in on their own, where the helicopters had to come in on their own, and where Det A and Delta were in fact passengers. And then at that marshalling area, Charlie Beck would become the sole commander of the helicopters proceeding forward at that point in time, okay, and the entire ground force. So, but nonetheless, that is what the Holloway Commission said. We, out of that failure, had many significant lessons learned. Lessons in intelligence. We built a special mission unit concentrating on intelligence that continues to have untold success today, okay? I'll just give you one hint. You've heard of this asshole named Soleimani that came out of Iran and was assassinated in Iraq? Well, he was surveilled not only in Iraq, but other locations. You go figure out where, by that intelligence unit. Okay. We've built a better human intelligence capability within SF. Where's my nephew, Alan Shoemate? Alan not here? Okay. Alan, before he retired, had command of something called OSW, Organization for Special Warfare. But they have built a capability for SF, again, to get back into human intelligence. And so we're doing a hell of a lot more, not only nationally, but within special operations and within SF to build better intelligence capability. Operation security continues to be a problem because when fighting in a coalition concept, we don't have standardization either jointly between our U.S.-American services on operation security matters, much less on a coalition basis. So it's still a challenge. But we at least learned some things. Command and control. We built a standing task force, the so-called Counterterrorism Joint Task Force. The media calls it JSOC, okay? DOD won't disclose what the name of that standing Counterterrorism Joint Task Force is. Go figure. We learned lessons on unity of force structure. We're doing better today, but not perfectly, okay? And when I say not perfectly, as an example, when we went into Afghanistan in 2001, 2002, in 2002, we had the equivalent of 4 special operations task forces operating inside Afghanistan at the same time. You know, sometimes we need to understand that we can be our own worst enemies. But nonetheless, we have made progress in terms of unity of force structure. We do much better in terms of joint training, exercises, and rehearsals, to include coalition training. We do much better that day. And Special Forces is at the cutting edge of those kinds of training, rehearsals, and exercises. The resources that are available today are just enormous, just simply enormous, okay? I can't tell you what the special operations budget was in 1980, but I can tell you today it exceeds over $7 billion annually on base and some $2 billion plus on supplemental funding out of Congress. So $9+ billion today that we spend on special operations. We also have made significant improvements in our diplomacy. and the foreign assistance that we achieve from other countries around the world. Okay? And when you talk about diplomacy, look at today. So if there were to be another hostage situation, we could launch a one-night unrefueled helicopter mission out of Azerbaijan, which in 1980 was part of the Soviet Union. Today is its own independent nation with good relations between us and the Azerbaijanis. Okay? We could even come out of Turkmenistan over here. We could even potentially come out of the easternmost side of Iraq because everything has improved. Okay? You know, we had no close air support other than the AC-130s on this mission in 1980. But today, with our ability to project carrier battle groups inside the Persian Gulf, and today with the kinds of access we have out of countries like Kuwait, Iraq, etc., we could provide close air support. And the concept for the mission would change mightily. Okay? Rebirth for that low that we were in came about because of congressional champions. Now, we need to work today towards rebuilding that bipartisan support. After 1980, Sam Nunn, Democrat Georgia, Bill Cohen, Republican Maine, banded together with members of the House like Dan Daniels, a Democrat from Virginia, to bring things about, okay? Bipartisan, working together, common vision, okay? We had champions like Ben Schemer, who is a former West Point graduate, owner, editor, publisher of the Armed Forces Journal, very powerful figure in Washington, D.C. We had Jim Locker, Senate staffer that became one of the early assistant secretaries for special ops and low-intensity conflict. Ted Lunger, former special forces officer that was a House staffer and very significant in terms of working with Jim Locker to actually write the legislation called the Nunn-Cohen Bill that came about in 1986 that created the United States Special Operations Command and the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict. But between their interests and 1986, there were bad failures like Grenada and Beirut, where we simply showed that we did not know how to conduct joint operations, much less smaller operations, very well. Okay? And all of these folks up here had a common belief that the individual services could not provide the right kind of an approach to special operations collectively. And so they changed the law. Major Force Program 11 was conducted. So today, like I say, the base budget for USSOCOM Program 11 is over $7 billion a year. Okay? We created those things called Theater Special Operations Command. For those of you that were at SOAR last night, you heard the deputy commander from one of the Theater Special Operations Command, Special Ops Command Pacific, Sean Berg, Colonel Sean Berg, speak. Okay? Highly successful effort. We've gone from one general in 1980 to 8 flags alone in the United States Special Operations Command headquarters today. At Fort Bragg, within the USASOC community, I don't know how many damn generals there are today, but you know, more than we had colonels in 1980 in SF. I guarantee you that. Okay? We've gone from 10 Army colonels in 1980 to well over 100 today. Okay? The force has gone from 10,000 to almost 70,000 today. Okay? And believe it or not, counter-narcotics has become a vital portion of our ability to deal with terrorism. Why? Because that's $1 billion budget inside DOD alone, okay? And that money has been used effectively to also counter terrorism or counterinsurgency. Here is a picture of 9 of the hostages. at Arlington National Cemetery. For today, a ceremony conducted by the Air Commando Association every April 25th, where a memorial has been built there for them, okay? You know, when we started the Delta Force, the whole idea was that nobody would stay there forever and ever. So one of our great early operators was Chris Abel. Chris left Delta. The last I know when he retired, I think he was a CSM of one of the battalions, if not the CSM of the 3rd SF Group. This flag that I'm helping hold for him was the flag that he had inside his jacket that he had hoped to raise over the Iran, or the United States Embassy in Iran on April 25th, 1980, and never got the opportunity. A quote from Santayana: "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." So we try our most to remember the past, not on a maudlin emotional basis, but from a proper planning perspective. And I'll tell you honestly, sometimes it's not the easiest thing to do. But nonetheless, that is our challenge. Learn from the past and do not recreate it. With that, I'll be glad to answer any questions that you might have. Michael.
Ish, I don't know the difference in a RH-53 and a CH-53, except I know the tail and the rotors were both. We had CH-53 pilots flying for us in
Yes.
the South that were experienced,
Yes.
and I guarantee you would not have turned around and gone back.
Yes.
Was there any consideration of using those guys? One of the grapevine rumors I heard was each of the services needed a role to play, and that was the bone given to the Marines that they could fly the helicopter.
Yeah.
Was there any thought to the First Special Operations Squadron pilots?
Okay. So for those of you that did not hear Mike's question and comments, it was why didn't we use Air Force pilots that were experienced, that flew, you know, the Jolly Greens and HH-3s, et cetera, in Vietnam? Okay, so the succinct answer is, number one, they did not belong to Hurlburt and the First Special Operations Wing anymore. They had been totally decimated after Vietnam, and they were part of the Air Force Combat Search and Rescue element. And they were decimated in terms of numbers. As I recall, there were only 2 squadrons in existence, one in Mildenhall, England, and that one still continues to exist. And there was another one, I believe, on Guam or Okinawa, I forget which one, okay? But they were reduced totally in numbers. In fact, there was one Air Force pilot that was allowed to come in and join the task force. To me, that was dumb. But nonetheless, the reason we were given by General Vaught was that for OPSEC reasons, I do not want to raise the specter of these limited number of pilots leaving their assignments today and then not being seen for months. That was the reason we were given. You know, I would want to argue with that candidly, but nonetheless, so reduced number of aircraft outside of the First Special Operations Wing purview and OPSEC. Those were the reasons we were given. Now, as far as Marine aviators, the ranking guy on board the RH-53D that flew back to the Nimitz was then a Marine colonel by the name of Charles Pittman. He was not the pilot. The pilot was a Navy lieutenant commander by the name of Rod Davis. But Pittman had made a big name for himself by supposedly being a hotshot 53 pilot. Why he didn't take over the stick and fly into Desert One is beyond me. 5 years later, he goes from colonel, and his job was not really defined on the task force, advisor. But he was one of Chairman David Jones, the Air Force general that was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, butt boy. So he was one of his military assistants, okay? And I believe it was Pittman pushing for the Marine Corps to have its aviators fly the mission. God bless the Marines. All except one made it in, well, the one that went down for mechanical failure. So 6 of them made it in, okay? And yeah, they were shaken up. They had every reason to be shaken up. They made it in and they were prepared to fly on. So that's all you can ask for, you know? Okay, thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Sir?
Why did they leave those choppers intact? Why did they leave the choppers intact when they left?
My good friend Mike. We served time at Budap in Vietnam, okay? They panicked, Mike. You know, I would never lie to you, you know? They panicked. Why they would leave, and you appreciate, Mike was a SF communicator. Why they would leave fully encrypted, state-of-the-art crypto systems intact, I simply can't understand, okay? On board, the last bird to leave, and I got on it, okay, there was a Marine that was sitting on a fuel bladder, about to light a cigarette. And, you know, the Air Force crew chief, God bless him, whose name I don't know, took his long mic cord and just whipped it at him and snapped it across that Marine's face. God bless, you know. But they panicked. No other reason, you know.
Yes. One thing on those, each one of the choppers had a big ammo box between the pilot and co-pilot that was in there that had grenades and white phosphorus and thermite, and it was all rigged. All they had to do is open it up, pull the fuse lighters, and it would have destroyed it. That was my understanding. Ish can correct me if I'm
Yeah.
wrong. The reason you see those at Desert One still sitting there, they sat there and ran out of gas. They were still running when they left, because nobody shut down any birds on the desert.
Yeah.
So the reasons it took the Iranians so long to move them out of Desert One, they'd actually sat there and ran out of gas.
There was a,
Do you know of anybody who's written a book or anything that goes more depth than you did that has any credibility?
you know, there's been several books written from the air operation standpoint. The best one was written by deceased Colonel Jim Kyle. And he basically was a lead fixed-wing planner, to include the 141's support aircraft as well as the AC and EC and MC-130s. And his book was called The Guts to Try. So that is very, very accurate. There has been no real definitive book written about the helicopter side of the mission. There have been any number of articles that have been written, many of which conduct or have erroneous information in it. In terms of Delta, probably the best book in terms of Delta's formation is Delta Force, written by Charlie Beckwith. There is another book that you do not want to read, written by a guy named Eric Haney, that is full of himself, and that book is full of lies, okay? So, there's another book called Guest of the Ayatollah, written by Mark Bowden. Bowden's book is very good in terms of talking about the hostage experience and talking about some of the hostage takers. It is absolutely erroneous in terms of describing the military side of the house, because Mark Bowden candidly used the wrong researcher to help him on that book. So don't get guess of the Ayatollah.
Yes, sir. Just a statement. Carl Ashburn, retired Air Force. We lost 8 people back then. It could have been worse, a lot worse. If, in fact, the 6th helicopter was an operational and we would have gotten into Tehran, with the shape those helicopters were already in at that point, especially with the dust storm, fogging up filters and everything else, it may have been a merciful thing this happened at Desert One. Secondly, regardless of all that, the lessons we learned, I'm not sure we would ever build up the special ops force we have today had this not happened. And if we would, it would have taken a long time, a lot of decisions, and a lot of
Yeah.
minerals in your back. Instead, this accelerated the process. And it gave President Reagan, when he got elected, the leverage that scared the Iranians out of their shadows. And look what happened the moment he became president. Bam, our hostages were
Yep.
home. So a lot of good things occurred after this, which I think are positive.
Yes.
The negative thing would happen, but
Yeah.
something always positive. If we
Yeah.
put our will to it, that's the problem we face today. We've got the capability to wipe our enemies, but we don't have the will to pursue it. That's it.
Okay. And I'm almost in total agreement with you. The only thing that I would modify is that I did not think the mission would succeed, very honestly. Why? Because the dumb jackass Johnson that I had described that said we can't land in those 2 fields in the embassy also came up with some bullshit after we had interjected the advance party into Tehran. And there was an Iranian quartermaster compound adjacent to the embassy. And he asked a source that we had a leading question. The leading question was, Al, Iranian special forces can be in that compound, right? Well, if I ask you that question, there's only one answer you can give. Well, yeah, they could be. So we had to divert Dick Meadows, Federici, Clem Lemke, and Scotty for 2 days and 2 nights to go around that damn compound when they could have been reconnoitering landing zones for those helicopters. Because guess what? The mission impossible was that the helicopters were supposed to drop the ground force off before beginning morning nautical twilight, so before daylight, fly into the hills and land in unreconnoitered landing zones in the mountains. Any helicopter pilots, I defy you to want to fly that kind of damn mission. Now, the Marines were bravado in terms of wanting to fly it, but I'll tell you, that's where the mission was going to fail, So other than that, I totally agree with you. So out of the ashes of Phoenix, if you will, came our special operations capability today. The world's first and foremost. Yeah, and we still make some mistakes, but geez, we are far, far better off than we ever were before. So, any other, thank you for your comments, and totally agree with them.
Have you read that book? I think it's called something like Phoenix Out of the Ashes. The guy that was on the planning task force. I thought it was pretty well written myself.
Okay.
Did you?
No, I have not read that book. Yeah.
Yeah. I recommend, and then please let me know what you think.
Okay. Yeah.
Is there a follow-on mission planning?
Yes. But in perspective, some good came out of it, okay? But also in perspective, it was an opportunity for a whole bunch of wannabes to try and make a name for themselves. And it also put us backwards in a couple of instances. So, for example, there was an intelligence effort that called Yellow Fruit that came about. Yellow Fruit was led by a military intelligence lieutenant colonel who was traveling around the world, renting Mercedes, staying in five-star hotels with his wife, and were caught with their hands in the till. And it cost us greatly. There were all other kinds of things that happened by these wannabes, okay? But nonetheless, we made some progress. So, for example, General Meyer, who had ascended to become Army Chief of Staff, started what is called the Special Ops Division on the Army staff today. And he was the first one to say the Army is not going to wait for the other services. So he created the 160th, what today is the 160th Aviation Regiment. He gave authorization for that special mission unit intelligence that I described, et cetera.
Set up for the next,
Huh?
we got a speaker coming right behind you.
Who?
I think we'd rather hear you.
Does she have a distinguished member of the regiment medal? Huh? Hey, any other questions?
Anybody who wants to read, oh, sorry.
Well, remember I said each element is coming in separately. So in charge of the Marine helicopters was Lieutenant Colonel Ed C. In charge of the EC and MC-130s was Colonel Jim Kyle. In charge of the ground force was Charlie Beckwith, and Stan Olchevich was also there as a full colonel that was going to command the element that later was going to split off and go to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So in essence, you really had three. Because, Stan Olchevich was really second to Charlie. Yeah. Does that answer your question? At the task force, Vought perceived himself as being the ultimate commander, and he was. Yeah. So, as I described, all these separate elements are coming in on their own. Okay? So, and that chain of command was not criticized by the Holloway Commission. I'm kind of with you that, it should have been better coordinated. Anyway, any,
I want to kind of clear up something about Charlie. You knew Charlie like I did. Some of the old you guys, and sometimes we get around and talk together and read some of the early action reports. It was that Charlie really was not happy with the fact that he had to take so many troops, even though the admiral wanted to all, and Carter wanted an all-service deal to start with. Well, that sounds good. But like I know, Charlie goes for training. And he's got to have a lot of time to train. And he was unhappy, what we hear, he was unhappy with the fact that they didn't have the right kind of training that was really needed and the exercises to go through. Now, and also unhappy taking so many people that weren't from the SF, Delta. What do you say about that? I still think Charlie was not happy with it, but he was forced by the admiral.
well, I'll confide in you and tell you two stories, okay? And the rest of the audience. We went into isolation in mid-November at a CIA facility, okay? shortly after Vaught was appointed as the task force commander, I was standing next to Charlie as he, Bucky Hurst, and myself went to General Vaught, and Charlie said, "I need a pawn over the helicopter." Vaught literally told us, "Go to your room. Go to your room." Charlie was floored, but Vaught was the task force commander, and we had no goddamn choice. On the other hand, the agency provided the drivers to us, and they told us, "You can vet those drivers, and if they don't pass your muster, turn them back to us." Holy mackerel, what a difference, okay? So, you're right, Charlie was not happy. Okay. God bless you all.